October 16th, 1946, 1:11 in the morning. A converted gymnasium inside Nuremberg prison. 3 black wooden gallows stand under bright floodlights. Just 72 hours earlier, American soldiers played basketball on this very floor. Now, the room smells of fresh timber and disinfectant. The first condemned man enters the room. He is flanked by 2 U.S. Army sergeants. This is Joachim von Ribbentrop. He was Hitler's foreign minister and the architect of the pacts that ignited World War II. The footage would show a broken man. His hands are bound tightly with black leather straps. His face is the color of chalk. He begins the climb. 13 wooden steps lead to the platform. The sound of boots hitting wood echoes through the silent gym. The executioner places the noose around his neck. The trapdoor snaps open. Ribbentrop drops. But the physics of the execution fail. The drop is too short. His neck does not break. Behind a black curtain meant to hide the dying man, the witnesses hear a struggle. There are sounds of groaning and choking. Ribbentrop is not dead. He is slowly strangling to death. 9 more men are lined up in the hallway, listening to these sounds. They are waiting for their turn. This was the final act of the Nuremberg trials. 10 of the highest-ranking war criminals in history were scheduled to face the rope. Why did the execution become a torture session? At first glance, it was a professional military operation. In reality, it was a disaster. The man holding the rope was Sergeant John C. Woods. He was a fraud. Woods had lied to the U.S. Army about his past experience as a hangman. He claimed he had performed hundreds of executions. This was a lie. The evidence is in the timing. Some of the condemned took 28 minutes to die. The trapdoors were built too small. As the men fell, their faces slammed into the edges of the wooden frames. They were bleeding and conscious while they swung. Observation of the cells showed the true state of the Nazi elite. Some men wet themselves in terror. Others collapsed and had to be carried to the gallows. But one man was missing from the line. Hermann Göring. He was the designated successor to Hitler. 2 hours before his execution, he lay on his cot. He swallowed a smuggled copper casing filled with potassium cyanide. He cheated the rope. Events accelerated. The remaining 10 men were led out one by one. The incompetence of the executioner turned the justice of the Allies into a gruesome spectacle. It raises a hard question. Does it matter if war criminals suffer? History recorded the results, but the details remained hidden for years. The bodies were removed at night. Thus ended the leadership of the Third Reich. November 20th, 1945, 11 months before the executions. The first Nuremberg trial begins inside the Palace of Justice. This was a massive stone courthouse in Nuremberg, Germany. The Allies chose this location for a specific reason. Nuremberg was the heart of the regime. Hitler held his largest propaganda rallies on these grounds. He stood before hundreds of thousands. He announced the Nuremberg laws here, stripping Jews of their citizenship. Now, the city of rallies became the city of judgment. 24 defendants were originally named, but only 21 stood in the dock. Why was the number reduced? The reasons varied. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front, took his own life. He used a towel to hang himself in his cell before the first session began. Gustav Krupp, the industrialist, was too sick to move. His mind was gone. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, was missing. He was tried in absentia. The remaining 21 men represented every branch of the Nazi machine. Hermann Göring sat at the far left of the first row. He was prisoner number 1. He was the Reichsmarshal and Hitler's designated successor. Next to him was Rudolf Hess. In 1941, Hess flew a plane to Scotland in a failed attempt to negotiate peace. He appeared dazed. Then came Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Beside him sat Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the military. The second row held the administrators of terror. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was there. He took over the Reich Security main office after Heydrich's assassination. He oversaw the final phases of the Holocaust. Beside him sat Alfred Rosenberg, the man who wrote the party's racial ideology. Then came Hans Frank. He was known as the Butcher of Poland. He ruled the general government and ordered the deaths of millions. Wilhelm Frick sat nearby. He was the man who actually drafted the laws that began the persecution. The dock was crowded. It held admirals, generals, and governors. It even held Julius Streicher, the publisher of a pornographic anti-Semitic newspaper. These were not just soldiers. They were the architects of genocide and the planners of aggressive war. The charges were entirely new to international law. First, crimes against peace. This meant planning and starting a war of aggression. Second, war crimes. These were traditional violations of the rules of combat. Third, crimes against humanity. This covered the extermination, enslavement, and persecution of millions of civilians. Finally, conspiracy to commit these acts. How did the prosecution prove it? They didn't just use words. The trial lasted 10 months. Prosecutors played film footage of the liberation of concentration camps. The screen showed piles of bodies and walking skeletons. They called survivors to the stand. But the strongest evidence came from the Nazis themselves. The prosecution presented thousands of documents signed by the men in the dock. These papers gave the orders for mass murder. The evidence was undeniable. It came from their own filing cabinets. There was no way to hide. The world watched as the evidence mounted. Day after day, the details of the Einsatzgruppen death squads were read aloud. These units followed the army to execute civilians by the hundreds of thousands. The scale of the slaughter was recorded in precise reports. The defendants listened through headphones. Some looked away. Others stared at the floor. The verdict was approaching. There was no turning back. 1 million dead. This was the recorded count of Jews shot across the Soviet Union. The prosecution presented the evidence. Documents from the Wannsee Conference appeared on the screens. The text outlined the logistics for the final solution. There was no ambiguity. There was only the plan for mass murder. Why did the defendants remain silent? At first glance, they were defiant leaders, but in reality, they were desperate men. They reached for any excuse. Some claimed they had no knowledge of the Holocaust. Others argued they were merely following military orders. Most pointed their fingers at one man, Adolf Hitler. He had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker 6 months before the session started. He was a ghost they could blame for everything. But the paper trail was too long. The evidence was undeniable. The footage shows crates of documents, signed orders, and photographs of the camps. These men had not just watched. These men had signed the warrants. These men had supervised the killings. There was no way out. October 1st, 1946. This was the day of judgment. The International Military Tribunal had met for 216 sessions. The courtroom was silent. The judges sat in a row. The verdicts were ready. 19 defendants were convicted, 3 were acquitted and walked free. Of those found guilty, the court sentenced 12 to death by hanging. The names were read aloud in the cold room. Martin Bormann, sentenced in absentia. Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, Hermann Göring, Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Wilhelm Keitel, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Alfred Rosenberg, Fritz Sauckel, the man who built the slave labor system, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the ruler of the occupied Netherlands. Finally, Julius Streicher. The camera records the moment of the sentence. Reactions varied. Göring did not flinch. He smirked and shrugged his shoulders. He had already accepted his end. Ribbentrop reacted differently. His face turned white. His hands began to tremble visibly against the wood of the dock. Keitel maintained the posture of an old soldier. He stood at attention, kept his eyes forward, and accepted the fate of the gallows. The court adjourned. The era of the Third Reich was officially over. October 16th, 1946, just past midnight. This was the date set for the final act of the Nuremberg trials. Under Allied law, the executioner had a window of 7 to 15 days after the verdict. The clock began to tick. For 2 weeks, the condemned men waited in their cells. The routine was mechanical. Some spent their final hours writing letters to family. Others knelt on the cold stone floors to pray with chaplains. A few remained silent, maintaining a mask of defiance. But Hermann Göring was busy with a different task. He was planning an escape. Was it a physical escape? No. There was no way out of the Nuremberg prison complex. The walls were thick, The guards were numerous, and the exits were bolted. But Göring refused to let the Allies have the final word. He would not give them the satisfaction of the rope. Throughout the trial, Göring dominated the courtroom. He was the highest-ranking Nazi in the dock. He was sharp, charismatic, and unrepentant. He didn't just sit there. He cross-examined witnesses, he lectured the judges, he defended Nazi ideology and forced the other defendants to stay in line. Even after the death sentence was read, his arrogance remained intact. Göring wrote multiple formal letters to the commission. He made one demand: change the method of execution. He wanted a firing squad instead of the gallows. He argued that as a former Reichsmarshal and a soldier, he deserved a soldier's death. He claimed the hangman's noose was for common criminals, not men of his rank. The requests were flatly denied. The tribunal's charter was specific. All death sentences would be carried out by hanging. There would be no exceptions for the former head of the Luftwaffe. Göring moved to his backup plan. He had been in possession of a cyanide capsule for months. He may have had it since the day of his arrest. How did he hide it? Guards searched him repeatedly. They inspected his clothes, his bed, and his body. Sentries watched him 24 hours a day through a small window in his cell door. How did he bypass the security? No one knows for certain. The leading theory suggests an American guard was bribed to smuggle the poison in. Others think it was hidden in a jar of pomade. Göring took the secret to his grave. October 15th, the evening before the execution. The prison was under maximum alert. Guards performed regular checks, walking the corridors every few minutes. At 9:30 p.m., journalists were allowed to walk past the cells to observe the prisoners. In the frame, Göring appeared to be sleeping. His hands were positioned outside the blankets, exactly as prison regulations required. The guard checked again at 10:45 p.m. Through the small glass window, everything looked normal. Göring was still lying on his back. He seemed to be in a deep sleep. But something was wrong. At 10:50 p.m., the guard noticed a sudden movement. Göring was twitching. His body jerked under the sheets. The guard shouted for the corporal. They grabbed the keys and rushed into the cell. The camera records the scene. Göring was in the middle of a violent convulsion. His face was contorted. A faint smell of bitter almonds filled the small room. Why did the guards fail? They were supposed to prevent this exact scenario, but Göring's pride was more effective than their surveillance. The doctors arrived within minutes. It was too late. The man who was supposed to hang in 2 hours was already dead on his cot. Thus ended the life of the Reich's second-in-command. The gallows would stand empty for him. 10:45 p.m., Hermann Göring lay on his prison cot. Suddenly his body began to shake. Violent spasms gripped his chest and limbs. The doctor arrived in the cell within minutes. He checked the pulse. He looked at the eyes. There was nothing to be done. Göring was dying. He had hidden a cyanide capsule in his mouth and bitten down. The poison entered his bloodstream instantly. Within moments, the Reichsmarshal was dead. This happened exactly 2 hours before his scheduled execution. Why did the guards fail? They were supposed to watch him every minute. But Göring had a plan. The guards searched the body. Near his hand, they found a small brass cartridge case. Inside were the shards of a broken glass vial. They also discovered 3 letters. One was for the prison commandant. In it, Göring claimed he had the poison since the day of his arrest. He stated he would never submit to the rope. Another letter was for his wife, Emmy. The military authorities seized the documents. Most of the text remains classified to this day. The suicide enraged the American commanders. The plan was simple. Show the world the Reichsmarshal broken on the gallows. They wanted the image of his body hanging in the gymnasium. Instead, Göring won a final battle. He cheated the hangman. He died on his own terms. The execution schedule changed instantly. 1 gallows now stood empty. 11 men were sentenced to die, but only 10 remained. 1 a.m., October 16, 1946. Guards began moving the prisoners. They marched them from their cells toward the gymnasium. The room was a converted basketball court. It measured 33 feet wide and 80 feet long. The plaster on the walls was cracked. 3 black wooden gallows stood in a row. The soldiers used 2 of them alternately to speed up the killings. The third was a backup. Each structure was 8 feet high. Each platform was 8 feet square. To reach the top, The condemned had to climb 13 wooden steps. A rope hung from the crossbeam. The noose had exactly 13 coils. The American military protocol used a trap door. A lever was pulled. The floor dropped. Under the British long drop method, the fall was 8 to 10 feet. This broke the neck instantly at the second vertebra, but the Americans used the standard drop. This was different. The fall was only 4 to 6 feet. It did not break the neck. Instead, the weight of the body caused slow strangulation. It was a long, painful death. The U.S. Army considered this acceptable. Who was the man pulling the lever? Master Sergeant John C. Woods. He was a 35-year-old soldier from Kansas. Woods told his superiors he was an expert. He claimed he had performed dozens of hangings in Texas and Oklahoma. In reality, it was all a lie. The Army never checked his records. Woods had zero experience with a noose. He had learned about executions by watching cowboy movies as a child. The military needed a volunteer for the most famous execution in history. Woods raised his hand. They gave him the job. He stood on the platform with his assistant, Joseph Maltz. The first prisoner was about to enter the room. One executioner was a 28-year-old military policeman. He and his partner had a schedule to maintain: 10 executions. The window was narrow, between 1:11 a.m. and 3 in the morning. 2 hours to hang 10 men. The first name on the list was Joachim von Ribbentrop. Guards entered the small cell. They unlocked his handcuffs and pulled his arms behind his back. They tightened leather straps around his wrists. Ribbentrop walked out of the cell, through a dark courtyard, and into the gymnasium. The footage would have shown a man flanked by 2 army sergeants. They gripped his biceps. At first, Ribbentrop looked calm. Then he saw the equipment. 3 black gallows stood in the center of the room. His face turned pale. His composure disappeared. An officer stood at the base of the wooden steps. He asked for the prisoner's name. Ribbentrop remained silent. The officer asked again. Ribbentrop screamed his name. His voice cracked. He climbed the 13 steps to the platform. He did not stop, but his legs shook. The executioner stepped forward. He looped the thick rope around Ribbentrop's neck. The official asked for his final words. Ribbentrop spoke quickly. He asked for God to protect Germany and for peace between East and West. The words were a desperate rush. The executioner pulled a black hood over his head. The lever moved. The trapdoor opened. Ribbentrop fell. A black curtain hid the bottom of the gallows. Witnesses stood in silence. Then the sounds began. The rope creaked under the weight. The sound of groaning came from behind the curtain. The body swung back and forth. The execution failed to go as planned. Ribbentrop did not die instantly. Minutes passed. The struggling continued. Finally, the room went quiet. A United States Army doctor walked behind the curtain to check the pulse. At 1:29 a.m., the doctor made the announcement. Ribbentrop was dead. 18 minutes had passed since he entered the room. A standard hanging takes less than 5 minutes. Ribbentrop had spent over 10 minutes slowly strangling. 9 men remained. At 1:44 a.m., the guards brought in Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. He was 64 years old. The process began again. Wilhelm Keitel was the highest-ranking military officer among the condemned. He had signed orders for countless atrocities. These included the Commando Order, which authorized the execution of captured Allied soldiers. He also signed the Commissar Order, legalizing the execution of Soviet political officers. Over 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German custody. Keitel had approved the conditions that killed them. Why did he remain calm? It was a final display of military discipline. He walked steadily between his guards. His shoulders were back, his posture was erect. When asked for his name, he stated it clearly. He mounted the gallows steps without hesitation. On the platform, standing beneath the noose, Keitel spoke his final words. He called on God to show mercy to the German people. He mentioned that 2 million German soldiers had died for the fatherland before him. He stated that he was now following his sons. He ended with a final salute, all for Germany. The mention of his sons was a rare moment of personal grief. Both of Keitel's sons had been killed in action during the war. Now, their father would join them. The hangman placed the hood over his head. The trap door opened. Keitel dropped. Behind the curtain, the sounds of failure began. Groaning and struggling echoed through the room. The rope creaked under the weight of a body fighting for air. Keitel took much longer to die than Ribbentrop. How long did the agony last? Reports indicate the execution took between 24 and 28 minutes. It was nearly half an hour of slow strangulation. Witnesses later claimed they could hear Keitel praying behind the curtain. His muffled voice cried out to God until his heart finally stopped. 2 in the morning. Ernst Kaltenbrunner climbed the gallows. He stood 6 feet 7 inches tall. He was the largest of the condemned men. He was a giant with a scarred face. From 1943 until the end of the war, he headed the Reich Security main office. He controlled the Gestapo and the concentration camps. Kaltenbrunner was responsible for millions of deaths. At his trial, he claimed he knew nothing about the Holocaust. The evidence proved otherwise. Now, the consequences arrived. The footage from the trial shows his cold, unwavering expression. He offered a final statement. He claimed to have loved his people with a warm heart. He stated he had done his duty according to the law. He blamed the crimes on leaders who were not soldiers. He claimed he had no knowledge of the atrocities. He ended by wishing Germany luck. The excuse was a lie. Prosecutors had already proven he saw the camps firsthand. The hood went over his head. The trap opened. Because of his height, the drop was longer than the others. He died faster than Keitel, but his end was not instant. At 2:12 in the morning, the doctor pronounced him dead. 12 minutes had passed since he entered the room. The chamber grew silent again, but more men were waiting in the cells. 2 hours and 17 minutes past midnight. Alfred Rosenberg walked toward the gallows. He was the chief racial theorist of the Nazi Party. This man provided the ideological blueprint for genocide. His book, The Myth of the 20th Century, was mandatory reading for every German citizen. Only Mein Kampf surpassed it in influence. Rosenberg served as the Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories. In this role, he authorized the systematic murder and enslavement of millions. Slavs and Jews were his primary targets. Now, he stood before the hangman. Why did he remain silent? 10 men were condemned to die that night. 9 of them spoke. Rosenberg was the only one who uttered no final words. He stood motionless while the executioner adjusted the noose. The footage would have shown a man without expression. Some witnesses claimed he had accepted his fate. Others believed he was showing a final act of stubborn defiance. The trapdoor opened. Rosenberg fell. Medical officers checked his pulse. They pronounced him dead at 2 hours and 31 minutes past midnight. 14 minutes had passed since he entered the room. 2 hours and 38 minutes past midnight. Hans Frank entered next. He was the Governor General of occupied Poland. Under his command, millions were executed or worked to death. He lived in Wawel Castle in Krakow. He called himself the King of Poland. He lived like a medieval tyrant while his subordinates built the Warsaw Ghetto. His administration oversaw the liquidation of 3 million Polish Jews. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Poles were also murdered, but Frank changed while in his cell. He claimed to have found God. He converted to Catholicism. He turned over his personal diaries to the prosecution. These books contained 42 volumes of evidence. He even testified against his former colleagues. On the gallows, Frank spoke. His voice was calm. He thanked his captors for their treatment. He asked for God's mercy. He looked relieved. The trapdoor opened. 7 minutes later, he was dead. It was one of the fastest executions of the night, 2 hours and 53 minutes past midnight. Wilhelm Frick climbed the 13 steps. He was 69 years old. This made him the oldest man in the group. As the Minister of the Interior, he drafted the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped Jews of their citizenship. He created the legal framework for the Holocaust. Frick also signed the orders for the euthanasia program. This program murdered 70,000 disabled Germans. He managed the annexation of Austria. He integrated stolen lands into the Reich. But on the gallows, his strength failed. The camera records a frail man. Frick stumbled on the stairs. Guards had to grab his arms to keep him upright. He regained his footing for a moment. He shouted, "Long live eternal Germany." Then the hood covered his face. The trapdoor opened. At 3 in the morning, his heart stopped. 3 hours and 5 minutes past midnight. Julius Streicher entered. Streicher represented a specific category of evil. He was the publisher of Der Stürmer. This was a viciously anti-Semitic newspaper. For 2 decades, he poisoned the minds of the German public. At first glance, a journalist, but in reality, a merchant of hate. Streicher did not pull a trigger. He did not sign a death warrant. Instead, he convinced a nation that murder was a necessity. Events accelerated as he reached the platform. He screamed at the witnesses. He spat at the executioner. There was no dignity in his final moments. He was a man who lived by hatred and died shouting it.